least in it did something something.
Hello, can you hear? I find all this technology between a hearing aid and glasses and all this kind of thing, if I suddenly go like this, there's been a short, right? It's not that I'm eccentric, I am that, but it's not, yeah. Thank you very much for having me here. Delmet sort of said, well, what are we going to talk about? And should we talk about brain function and then have some questions? And I'm sure you're not here because you want to know how the brain works primarily, but I'm sure because, listen, depression, they say 20% of people suffer from depression at some stage in their life. Anxiety is more common, okay? By the time you've added ADD and substance abuse and all the rest of it, probably half of us have got a psychiatric diagnosis before we've reached middle life, okay? So it's very, very common. And yet people often think mental illness is a strange thing. If you go to see a psychiatrist, you're crazy. And I've spent nearly 40 years trying to persuade people, look, the world's divided into two kinds of people. Those with a psychiatric diagnosis and those who caused it, okay? And the reality is that being depressed, I've been depressed, I've said to numbers of congregations talking about this, I say, if I said to you, I'm taking blood pressure pills, I say, what's the big deal? And I say, I'm also taking antidepressants. And they but actually, in a fallen, broken world, we have all kinds of things, from dental caries to stomach ulcers to heart problems to all the rest. And I see a lot of us are about my sort of age, so we in the era where we accumulate these things. And psychiatric things are part of that. It's not a strange thing. It's part of normality. I often say to people, you're depressed, join the human race. It's perfectly normal to get depressed sometimes, to get anxious. For some people, it's crippling, and that's another story. But the reality is, I find it so sad when people could be hugely helped simply by taking a tablet every morning. Their whole mood could change. They would be less anxious, they'd be happy, and so on. And they won't, because they think, what are the implications? Am I going to get addicted to these things? I say, nonsense, man. If it's addictive, I wouldn't give it to you, Anyway, but we're supposed to, before that, talk about the brain. And I've brought a brain along that I've carried around with me for many years, because I've taught this stuff for a long time. And I want to talk a little bit about the brain, and then we're going to have questions when we can pick up the psychiatric questions, mental health questions that you would like to ask. But it's important to talk about the brain. Particularly in a church context, people often think psychiatric things are spiritual things, okay? And you can't treat spiritual things with tablets. And I say, no, it's far too simple an idea, that. All of us have a spiritual part to us which we can't see, but when we die, we'll be conscious immediately somewhere else. When our body goes to the anatomy department, as I dissected many such bodies, okay, well, your body's there, but there's a part of you that stays alive, and that's your spirit, and that's your soul. And it operates with us all the time. But to say your particular psychiatric problem is a spiritual issue, or it's a biological issue, I say you can't separate them. Often said, if Cheslin Colby was running down the rugby field, and as he crossed the 22, his spirit left his body, would he score the try? Okay? If his spirit left his body, he's dead. Okay? Right? So is it his spirit that scores the try? Now, don't be silly. You know how he scores tries. Okay? We are a package. And we've got to live with the fact that we're a package. Now, I'm not saying we don't have spiritual problems. Sure we do. Okay? But we function as one unit. And I think often we underestimate just how significant the brain is in our thinking, in our functioning, in terms of psychiatric problems and so on. It really is enormously significant. says in the good book how we're made in the image of God. And I spent years thinking about the image of God must relate to our spiritual nature. And then I thought, no, it's not true. It's not true. You know, I carry around in my Bible a picture of my wife, and I say, this is an image of my wife. People say, well, I say, this is my wife, and they say, she's quite thin, she's only about a tenth of a millimeter thick. I say, no, she is slim, but, you know, the reality, it's an image. An image is not the same as the original thing. I may be the image of God, but that doesn't mean to say I'm God, okay? God can think without a brain. God can feel without a brain. God can make moral decisions without a brain. I can't. Okay? That's the way we're made. Okay? And so the spiritual and the physical side are one unit. And that's the reality of it. Now, working in psychiatry, as I've done, we're mainly dealing with the biology and talking together as people to people. Okay? And we try and help somebody who's depressed or anxious or has got this problem or that problem. Sometimes it's obviously a biological problem. Okay? Sometimes people's moods just go up and down for no reason. Obviously a biological problem, you deal with it. But there's a lot of reasons why people get depressed, eh? Okay. Anyway, I'm supposed to be talking about brain function and time's going. So can I tell you a little bit about the brain? Because I want to feel justified about doing that. And I was thinking about how on earth do you talk about the brain in half an hour? You know, it's like saying, old exam question, describe the universe, be brief, okay? The brain is indescribably complex. It's not very good looking, but then apart from neurosurgeons, nobody ever looks at it, okay? So it's not a great thing to look at. It is unbelievably sophisticated. It's just beautiful. And I've been doing science for more than 50 years now. And the more I do it, the more I think this is just magnificent. All the way from physics through to birds, which I like, to brains and so on. Superbly designed. Now, some people don't think it's designed, and I don't want to argue. But the reality is, to my mind, it screams that somebody incredibly smart put this thing together. Okay? And let me tell you a couple of bits in here, and then I'll sort of show you around, and then we can pick it up relevant. We talk about mental illness. This front part over here is called the frontal lobe, okay? And it sits behind your forehead over here. The back part of it is involved in movement, which not terribly interested in here. Very smart, but it's involved in movement. The front part is more involved in thinking and functioning. I should mention down the bottom here is an area called Broca's area that controls speech. If it gets squashed, you can't speak. I had an aunt who lived just around the corner here about 25 years ago, and one day she was sitting chatting to her daughter at lunch, and she stopped speaking. And then she said a bit more, and then she stopped speaking, and they contacted me and said, you know, May's not speaking. She had a tumor in her frontal lobe, okay? And it had squashed the Broca's area, and she just stopped speaking. Actually never recovered from that. She had an operation, didn't come around for it. But she had a huge tumor in her frontal lobe here, which is very interesting because that area is involved in decision-making, moral judgments, all those sort of things. Okay? And nobody noticed that she changed. She couldn't speak. That was the first time anybody knew there was a problem, but a great chunk of her brain had died. Why? Because moral judgments and subtle decision-making and that sort of thing is not obvious. What do you do with this part of the brain here? This part's dorsolateral prefrontal cortex involved in executive functioning. Executive function is what the CEO of Woolworths does. Okay? When are we going to buy that company? Should we buy it? No, we're not going to buy it. We'll buy that one. When should we do it? When are we going to time the new shop? Okay? How are we going to organize the people who are going to do this? It's the management kind of things. And your management skills sit in your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Okay? Some are very good at that. Time management, for example, sits there. I've got ADD, which I discovered when I was in my 50s, and the lights came on. Right? I find it incredibly difficult to manage time. Okay? And the time management area, ADHD, is dysfunction of the frontal parts of the brain. If you know somebody's got ADHD, you think that's bad news. I say it can be good news. If you're running an advertising agency, you've got to have ADD. I've known 3 people running advertising agencies who had ADD, and they were very good at what they did. Okay? If you think too linearly, you can't advertise anything. So ADD people think sideways, which is an advantage. An advantage as a teacher. Okay? But it's not great if you're an accountant. Okay? And so dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, executive decision making. The area underneath here, that's for taste and appreciation and enjoyment and seeing beauty. What's seeing beauty? Well, you know what it's like. You see something, and different things do different things to different people. But this area, firstly, they say the inside part of it lights up when you eat chocolate. I've got a daughter who's a neuroscientist, and we've done some work on functional MRI scanning, where you do an MRI scan, and then you get people to do things, and you can see which bits of their brain are working. So if they're looking at things, the back part of their brain becomes active. Okay. Now, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex becomes active, they say, when somebody eats chocolate, the medial part does. But I saw an interesting study where they'd said mathematicians, now mathematicians, strange people, you're probably a mathematician here, but strange people, because they can look at equations and say, that equation's beautiful. Okay? But they look at it and say, it's a beautiful equation. And they did fMRI scans on mathematicians and non-mathematicians looking at equations. And when the mathematicians looked at beautiful equations, this area of the brain lit up. It's the capacity to see beauty. And I heard about a guy who had a stroke in the area just behind that, and a young guy. And he loved Rachmaninoff's music, which meant that he was normal. Rachmaninoff's beautiful music. Okay? He had this little stroke, and afterwards, he lost his passion for Rachmaninoff. He didn't lose his musicality, but Rachmaninoff was gone. Okay? And he'd lost the back part of this ability to appreciate beauty. Okay? Now, we can go on talking about those things all night. The inside here talks about social brain, social awareness. How do you know what another person's thinking? Some people can't do that, eh? And we've got to be kind. Some people just do not know that they've put their foot in it. They really do not know that you can't go and talk to those 2 women there because they're having a deep conversation and you mustn't go and talk to them. But if you don't know that, you don't know that. Okay? Now that's also a brain function. Moral judgment is here. Okay? I had a patient some years ago who was a professional man, and he got had up for stealing money out of trust funds. And he came to see me because he was very depressed, and we chatted for a while, and I treated him with tablets for depression. And then he mentioned something about having had a brain infection previously, and I thought, I haven't scanned this man's brain. Okay? And it had created havoc that he'd done this, because he was a good guy. He was a decent man. But he started stealing at the age of 60. Okay? And we did the brain scan, and I was relieved to find that he had atrophy of his frontal lobe and the front part of his temporal lobe. Why was I relieved? Because that meant it wasn't his fault. Right? And it was a pleasure to say to him and read the scan results to him and his wife, and they could communicate with the daughters who'd been mortified by the fact, if I started stealing now, people say, what? What? See? It's not his fault. It's not his fault. His frontal lobe's atrophied. Okay? So there's different parts there. Over here, this part here is involved in sensation from the body and that kind of area. There's an area down the bottom for speech. Okay? This part, by the way, is the part that you speak with. It's called Broca's area. Okay? This area over here understands speech. It's called Wernicke's area, both on the left, usually. Okay? And with my aunt, who had stopped speaking, I said to the family, you just be very careful what you say in front of me. She sat there looking fatuous. She'd lost her ability to communicate. She couldn't even communicate facially. She just couldn't communicate. And so she sat there looking fatuous. She's a cultured, switched-on woman. I said to you, be careful what you say in front of May. If you say, oh, May's got a tumor in her brain, she's going to die. She knows what you're saying. She just can't respond to it. Okay? Okay? So that's Wernicke's area, understands speech. In all the sophistication, let me give you a reason to be impressed by these things. I've thought the whole linguistic and languages departments at university, you could put in a dessert spoon. Okay? You think of all the language ability in this room. I won't ask you how many languages we can speak here. It all sits in Wernicke's speech area. And bits attached. It's always more complicated, by the way. Always more complicated. But you've got a little area like that with all of speech and communication and so on. I mean, it's awesome. Look, we can go on there. I've got to move on quite fast because time marches on. Inside, maybe I should mention this yellow area here, which is on the inside of the brain near the midline. It's called the limbic system. Now, when I was a student, it was quite simple. The limbic system was involved in emotion and memory. But as time's gone by, you realize it's much more complicated. I had to deal with my students, by the way. I said, if you come to the end of an essay and you know you haven't written enough, you can always say, but it's much more complicated than that. And I will always give you a mark. Okay? Because it is. It is. Everywhere. I teach ethics now at the college around the corner. Always more complicated. Don't consider, but with the brain, it's indescribably complicated. Okay? But this limbic system is involved. There's a bit down the front, which is shaped like a rugby ball. It's called the amygdala. And it's involved in passionate emotion, as what happens when people watch rugby. Okay? So, shaped like a rugby ball, it's about that size. And passionate emotion, anger, rage, a desire to kill the ref, and all of that comes from the amygdala. Okay? There's an area just behind it, if I take this apart here. There's an area just behind it which is shaped like a foot, which is appropriate because a rugby ball sits in front of it. And the foot is called the hippocampus. You think of a hippo going to university, it's called the hippocampus. Okay? And the hippocampus is involved in fixing memory. It doesn't store all the memory there. Your visual memory gets stored in the visual part of your brain, and the hearing memory in the hearing part of the brain, and the musical memory in the musical parts of the brain. I had a patient who got musical hallucinations. Actually, that was interesting, but we won't go there. But the memories are stored all over the different parts of the brain. But the hippocampus has got the capacity to instruct other parts of the brain to remember things. Okay? It's almost like the hippocampus, and all of the roof of this building, it's a lovely building, all the roof and so on is the cerebral cortex, which is the part you're conscious with. Okay? I should have mentioned that at the beginning. Part on the surface of the brain, cerebral cortex, as a brutal generalization, it's the part you're conscious with. Okay? And what the hippocampus does is it scans your experience and it'll say, remember that. Okay? Remember that. Okay? Usually if it's related to emotion. Have you noticed if something doesn't grab you emotionally, you'll never remember it? I used to chat to a university colleague who was into teaching. The reality is that the students don't get excited about what you're talking about. They may be able to memorize it for exam, but next year it's gone. But if they're excited about it, it's another game. I'm sure there are some teachers among it. That's the critical thing. Now, the hippocampus does that. I'll tell you something interesting about it. It's involved in memory. It if you destroy the hippocampus, the person cannot remember a single thing subsequent to that. I had a patient many years ago in Rhodesia, in the psychiatric unit there. And he got seriously drunk for quite a while in Zambia. And at the end of it, he got what's called Korsakoff syndrome. And he was in the ward, and he could remember stone nothing for 10 years. It was 1977, and if you said to him, what year is it? He'd say 1963. And where are we? We're in Lusaka. No new memories. Okay? The hippocampus is destroyed, and you just can't make new memory. It's scary. It's scary. So, last bit, because time runneth out. Hang on, I'm having trouble reorientating my brain. In the inside of the brain, this is the bit that sits like that. We've been talking around the outside. If you look next to the midline, this area over here, okay, sticking out the bottom is a thing about the size of your thumb, which is called the brain stem. Just as a suggestion, if you're going to protect anything in life, protect your brain stem. Hey? Whatever the insurance company says and all the rest of it, you look after your brain stem. Because the brain stem is critical in keeping us alive. You're not conscious with your brain stem, but without it, you're not conscious. Okay? And what it is the part of the brain that controls heart rate and blood pressure. It's the area that the wires go through to the spinal cord and back. Right? And if it gets squashed, particularly up at the top, the person becomes instantly unconscious and may well never wake up again. I had a horrible experience 15 years ago. My sister phoned me up to say, Richard's in the ICU at Grootske. He's had a road accident. He was my nephew. Lovely guy. Also with ADD. Advertising agent, okay? And he'd been hit by a car, and I went through and looked at the brain scans. And the brain scans showed that this part of his brain had been squashed. There'd been pressure on the brain. It had squashed the upper part of his brain stem. And I had to say to my sister, he's never going to wake up. Okay. He's effectively brain dead. Okay. Now, this part of the brain might have been fine, but the brain stem is the bit that controls all the basic biological breathing and all the rest of it. He was on a ventilator, but they switched off the ventilator to see if he was brain dead or not. He didn't breathe. He wasn't conscious. There was no sign of brain functioning, okay? And that was his brain stem damaged. But hiding in there, there's some things that we need to talk about because they're psychiatrically relevant. There's some little spots of grey matter in the brain, which I won't go into, but there's some little spots there, and they produce chemicals that they pass up into the higher parts of the brain, which influence our mood. Okay? A lot of those centers, they're called the Rafe nuclei, and they make serotonin. Everybody's heard about serotonin. Most people don't realize that it's in your food, it's everywhere, and all the rest of it. But in the brain, it's got very specific function. And the antidepressants, if you've ever been on an antidepressant, there's a strong possibility the first one they started you on was a tablet that boosts serotonin function in your brain. Okay? And what does serotonin do? I saw in a technical book on one occasion, it dampens arousing stimuli. That's fun, that's easy language. But basically what the saying is, if you take an animal and you destroy their serotonin centers in the brain, they're hypervigilant. They're waiting for a cat to take them out. Okay? They're constantly anxious. Okay? What those SSRIs done, which is the most common antidepressants, they boost the amount of serotonin in the brain, and so you just feel calmer. Been on them myself. I wrote prescriptions myself. You take them, you feel calmer, you feel more relaxed. Okay? They lift your mood. I don't know why, but they lift your mood and they make you feel happier. Do they do that? They do. They do. To everybody? No pill works for everybody. But as a general rule, antidepressants rarely work. And if you're thinking, I'm really depressed, is it worth taking a tablet? To say, yes. Okay. And you say, oh, but I don't want to do that. I say, if you won't take them for your sake, take them for your wife's sake, for goodness sake. Okay? I said that at a meeting some years ago, and a guy phoned me up. A couple of weeks later. He said, you said if you won't take them for your sake, take them for your wife's sake. And I could hear his wife laughing in the background. And, because, of course, when you're depressed, when you're anxious, when you get down, you're not so easy to live with, hey? Now, I don't want to lay a burden on you, but that's the reality of it. And the tablets help. Okay? That's serotonin. And it sends fibers up to elsewhere in the brain, and it calms you down. There's another group of areas that my daughter's a real fundi on in the brain that produce dopamine. It's an in sort of thing. What does dopamine do? Well, it does various things. If you don't have enough dopamine in some parts of your brain, you get Parkinson's disease, which is pretty difficult. You get very stiff and shaky and that sort of thing. But from a psychiatry perspective, it's involved in pleasure and enjoyment. Okay? And with the pleasure and enjoyment, the ability to focus. Okay? I say, I've got ADD. Ritalin stimulates dopamine function in the brain. And what does it do? You can focus, for goodness sake. Okay? Your brain's not like a squash court. You can focus. And as somebody who's been on the inside of that, I discovered when I was 55 that I had ADD, pinched one of my son's tablets, and I had the most productive morning I'd had in 20 years. And I thought, oh. And 2 weeks later, somebody came into my office and said, what happened to your office? Because my office had always had piles of paper all over the place. I'd put the paper from the desk on the floor, then build up another pile and put it there, and it was chaos. And he came in and he said, what happened to your office? Because all the bookshelves were neat, there were no papers around, everything was organized, neat and tidy. Have you popped your clogs? Now I started taking Ritalin, okay? And, as I say, I discovered in middle life that I had it. We think of ADHD as something that happens in little kids. But 2/3 of people who had it as kids carry on having it through their life. And you try running a business with ADD. You may be very good at it. I was talking to a guy with ADD a while ago, a physiotherapist. Good guy. Vigorous, energetic, like crazy. And he said a couple of years previously, one way or another, they'd forgotten to send bills to people. So they were R1 million down because they actually didn't send accounts to people. Okay? Good physiotherapist, you better believe it. Good businessman, better believe it, but mustn't run the business. Okay? Anyway, so that's dopamine there. Just one thing what dopamine does, my dopamine daughter told me. If in this context I say something and you laugh, what actually happens, you get a little squirt of dopamine up into the thing called the nucleus accumbens here, and you focus. And you can concentrate for the next 20 minutes, or 10 minutes, and then I've got to tell another joke, okay? Right? And a lecture that's got no humor in it can be hard work. But the humor can be anything, okay? It doesn't need to be related to the content, because humor keeps us focused. Ritalin also keeps us focused, so you don't need to laugh, okay? There's another thing called noradrenaline center here. And noradrenaline makes you, it also creates focus and drive and motivation. You think motivation is just one of those things. No, it comes from the brain. Eh? It comes from the brain. There's motivational centers there. And you say, are you saying I'm just a brain? I say, no, of course not. Of course not. But the brain is critical. Okay? And if I'm talking to somebody who's depressed or whatever, if they acknowledge that there's spiritual issues and so on, we'll talk about that. We might pray together or something like that. But if they're depressed, find out what's going on. If they've created havoc at home, they must stop the havoc, okay? But actually the tablets help, okay? And they help you cope, okay? And just mustn't be shy about tablets if you're depressed. But I've gone over time. Delmo's very nice, and he hasn't waved his hands at me and told me to shut up. Okay. All right. Now, that was very broad and general and so on. Are there any specific questions? If it's an awkward question...
Yes, folks, sorry. Camera record time ran out at exactly 30 minutes. So we had to cut him to the quick. And we really do thank Dr. Chris Warton for a wonderful presentation, and thank you for viewing.